The following podcast may be disturbing to those who support hatred, terrorism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. Viewer discretion is advised.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to How We Fought Against. I am very, very happy and proud to have a guest. I'm honestly a fan. Richard Kemp is here with us today. Thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time and being here with us today.
It's my pleasure, great pleasure.
So, Richard, I mean, there's so much that we can discuss. I mean, I think just kind of following what you've done in your career, we'll talk a little bit about, your accomplishments, and you're a very respectable and decorated, general, and you've spent time in Afghanistan, and you were a part of some really, serious battles in your careers, and yet something is making me feel like this battle that you've started a few years ago might, in some respects, be even more challenging than the ones you've encountered on the battlefield.
I should start off really by correcting you. I hate to do this to someone of your esteem and importance, but I'd love to be a general, but I was actually a mere colonel. So I don't want your viewers to think that I'm assuming a higher rank than I was. So I was a colonel in the British Army, and I served for 30 years. And I did face a lot of challenges. I served in Afghanistan, Iraq, Northern Ireland, the Balkans, numerous other places where there was on some occasions some quite heavy fighting going on, so it was quite challenging, but a very different kind of challenge to what I'm involved with now. Obviously today there is a degree of danger in fighting the kind of fight that we are fighting, and I've been placed on an Al-Qaeda death list. Now that's not entirely due to the stance I've taken on Israel and other human rights related matters. It's also to do with my previous positions dealing with terrorism, with international terrorism. But you do get a lot of abuse. I get a lot of abuse anyway, a lot of anti-Semitic abuse in some cases, even though I'm not Jewish. And
well,
to be honest,
you get to enjoy this, just by sticking up to Jews or Israel, you get to be a part of this wonderful world of anti-Semitism. So that's a bonus.
I do actually welcome it, and that sounds an awful thing to say, but I do welcome it, because I know that when I get attacked by people on the internet or people face to face, sometimes at colleges and in the United Nations, that I'm saying the right things, that they're hitting the right mark, and therefore it causes that kind of resentment. But it's a different type of fight, but I think it's an equally important fight to the physical fight that many of us have taken part in. It's something we either, in the same way as when you are a soldier, you stand up, hopefully anyway, for what is right. I certainly did. And now in this position, I do my best also to stand up for what I believe to be right.
So this is, you would say, this was your main motivation, let's say. I think, making that decision of coming out, I mean, we're going to talk about, I think one of the things that you're most famous for, but since then you've done so much, is kind of coming out against the Goldstone report. From your position, from your military experience, from your understanding of what's going on the ground, is that what kind of led you to make a very, very unpopular position and oppose some of the conclusions that were published in that report?
Well, I think it is about standing up for what you know is right, and I can't see an injustice being done to anybody really, without being, if I'm able to do so, without standing against it. And that's the sort of experience I've had. In places like the Balkans, I was able to prevent ethnic cleansing in some parts of the Balkans, not because it was necessarily my absolute defined job to do it, but you can't just walk down the road and see someone getting beaten up and just turn a blind eye to it. And it's the same with this situation. So it's a question of dealing with what is right and trying to stand up for it. But also in the case of Israel, I worked very closely with Israeli government organizations like the IDF, Mossad, and other security and intelligence organizations over several years. And I recognized through that experience, how extremely valuable Israel has been to the rest of the world in terms of not only technology, cooperation, assisting, but also in terms of saving lives, providing intelligence, which has saved our soldiers' lives and our civilians' lives. So that's another kind of motivation for me. But also, having worked in the forces, having fought on a number of battlefields, and having seen firsthand the way that the Israelis do business, I immediately recognized when I started seeing the lies and the distortions on the news, in the media, in the United Nations, I immediately recognized that it was completely wrong. And I was therefore able to come to it with an objective assessment, a professional opinion based on my own personal experience. And the kind of fight that the IDF has been fighting and is still fighting is the same fight that we fought in different places around the world. And so it's much easier, I think, for somebody with a background like mine to understand it and to be ready to speak authoritatively and objectively about it.
So can you give us just kind of, I guess, generally, because we don't have the time to go into too many details, but what is it that you see that people either get wrong or maybe deliberately trying to present in a false way? But what is it that you think is the basis of that kind of misrepresentation or misunderstanding?
I don't think there's much misunderstanding. There is among ordinary people who listen to the news, listen to, for example, to the BBC and the Western media in many cases, and actually believe that the United Nations is in every respect a force for good. Yes, they can be misled by these organizations, but I think a lot of what we see in the media, in universities, in international organizations like the UN, the International Criminal Court, etc., we see deliberate distortions. And it results, I think, partly from decades and decades of propaganda, anti-Israel propaganda. What we've seen, what we're witnessing even today, is the greatest slur campaign in history against Israel. And it's the kind of distortions like Israel's right to exist, Israel's right to the territory it lives in. Things like that, which are distorted and people are misled about, and have been since, well, probably for 100 years, maybe more. But also about the details of the way that the IDF fight, and the distortions, for example, that the Israelis want to deliberately kill innocent women, children on the battlefield, and innocent men as well. And I think, one disadvantage that Israel has, the IDF has, is that it's so often seen in isolation, and people do scrutinize Israeli tactics, but they don't do what they do when they're scrutinizing, for example, American tactics and British tactics. They look at them in the context of a much wider international situation. Of course, Israel usually fights alone, and therefore it is looked at in many ways alone. And I think one thing that I've been able to do with other people is to make comparisons between the way Israel does business and the way that our armies do business, and by and large, it's exactly the same. If anything, Israel, I think, takes, even for a variety of reasons, takes even greater steps to save the lives of civilians on a battlefield against an enemy that deliberately wants and is trying to lure the IDF into killing their own people.
So my experience is, although I was in the IDF, but my experience is in the international arena, legal arena. We're working with the International Criminal Court. And so sometimes I think that people fail to understand what it means to have an asymmetrical warfare, what it means to, to kind of try to combat this terrorist organization that is, shooting rockets from within schools, or moving ammunition in ambulances, or firing from a mosque. And that is deliberate because they know what international law says. I mean, they can read international law just as well as I can read international law. And they understand what it looks like if the IDF then decides to take, to shoot back at a mosque, or do something with the ambulance. And they understand what kind of images and what that kind of brings out of people when they see children, in a house that was destroyed, or some civilians that were killed. And I imagine that your experience in all these, conflicts that you've described, kind of, firsthand what it's like to deal with that type of warfare, with that type of an enemy.
Yeah, I mean, the IDF is in a lose-lose situation when faced with that kind of enemy. In the same way as our armies are, the British Army and the American Army, French faced faced a very similar enemy, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the purpose of that enemy in using things like mosques, hospitals to store weapons, using human shields in front of them, there's two advantages for them. One is the hope that the IDF or the British or American forces won't attack them and will leave those military facilities able to continue to operate, and therefore they win out by that. But if, on the other hand, the IDF or the British Army decides to attack, and casualties, civilian casualties, are quite often the absolute unavoidable result of that, then of course they gain as well, because they have a victory in the media. They then use it, they film it, they distort it, they show the Israelis or the British or whatever killing innocent men, women, and children. And in many ways, that is the big bonus for them, because most of these organizations like Hamas and other terrorist groups, PIJ and Hezbollah, they do have quite significant resources. So if they lose some fighters, if they lose some weapons, ammunition, they don't really care too much about it. They'd rather not, but they don't mind too much if they do. But it's an even bigger bonus if they get the IDF to kill innocent civilians, or apparently innocent civilians, because that then gets all over the media. It gets into the United Nations Human Rights Council. It gets into the International Criminal Court. And that's what potentially does real damage to Israel. They know, organizations like Hamas know, they can't actually really defeat the IDF. They can't severely damage the IDF, but what they can do is to really destroy Israel's image and reputation in the international world, which of course has huge repercussions.
Yes, so let's talk about Goldstone specifically. So this is about a decade ago now. And so the report comes out, and you know, there was a shockwave all across the country here in Israel. And so describe, if you can, when you see the report, or when you first are exposed to the content of the report, what kind of a reaction does it get out of you?
Well, I was aware of the kind of stuff that was in the report just by virtue of what was being said about that campaign, Operation Cast Lead, for months beforehand, and I was well aware of it, so it didn't come as any surprise to me. It was very clearly deliberate distortion and lies. And one thing that struck me about it, actually, as a military person, was that the Goldstone had a military advisor, but his military advisor had no combat experience. He was a retired colonel in the Irish Army. The Irish Army has never actually fought in a war. A lot of it was to do with air operations, with IDF attacks from the air. The Irish don't have an air force, so he had no experience to deploy to give an insight into what was going on. He had a political agenda himself, as did Judge Goldstone and the people around him at the time. So they were the report actually wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. And I was able to highlight the reality of what had happened and what the IDF had done, and refute pretty much everything that Goldstone said. And actually, I was extremely pleased a while later when Judge Goldstone realized the error of his ways and retracted what he said, even though other members of his team, including his military advisor, refused to do so.
Yeah, so you just, how did you go about that? Did you write to Goldstone specifically? I know that you were interviewed a few times, so you really decided to take this on as something that was important to you at the time?
Yeah, I wrote a number of articles. I attended some conferences in which I spoke about the Goldstone report, including conferences in Jerusalem. I think the key moment for me, really, the place that I possibly had the greatest impact was in the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I was invited by an organization, an outstanding organization called UN Watch, led by Hillel Neuer. I was invited by them to come and make a speech at the UN Human Rights Council, which I did. You don't get very long, it's short and sharp. And I was one of out of a room of hundreds of people making speeches, ambassadors from around the world, predominantly, and some NGOs. I was one of possibly 2 or 3 whose speech actually told the truth about Israel. Wasn't just there to condemn Israel. I had to listen for 2 days, I think it was, to this complete rubbish being spewed out by these ambassadors who knew nothing. I went and spoke to them sometimes, in the intervals between the event. I went and spoke to some of these ambassadors and questioned them on what they said, and they couldn't go beyond the lines they'd had written down on the page form for them. And at the end of it, I was approached by an ambassador from one of the Arab countries, who said to me, "Colonel Kemp, your soul will burn in hell for the lies you have told here today." And I took that as a great compliment, because I knew what her stance was on Israel.
So I think a lot of countries, a lot of leaders don't seem to understand that if there's a precedent that is created in the Israeli context, then this precedent, this new rule of international law, this way of interpreting or understanding international law, will then potentially affect every other country, even when they are forced to defend themselves in a similar situation. And unfortunately, I don't see the world. I mean, I wish and I pray for that every night, but I don't see the world, turning into this peaceful utopian place tomorrow morning. So I assume, there will be more battles for us to fight. So what is your assessment? Do they not understand? Do the generals and leaders do not understand that once they kind of shoot themselves in the leg when narrowing down interpretation of international law, tomorrow it will be, a problem for them to defend their soldiers or their countries?
Well, it's a really good point you raise. And I don't think you'll hear very many Western generals condemning the IDF's actions. In fact, after Operation Cast Lead, the US chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent a team across to Israel to study the way that the IDF had avoided civilian casualties so successfully. And I know that some of the methods used by the IDF were taken and used by the Americans and the British in Afghanistan and in Iraq, because they had been so successful at defeating the enemy and at the same time preventing unnecessary civilian casualties. And I was in Israel myself with a group of retired generals, about 13 retired generals from around the world, from countries like Australia, France, Italy, Germany, the UK, the US. And they were quite concerned about what they were going to find. They didn't have a dog in the fight. They didn't really have any experience of Israel. They were looking at it, they were doing an objective study of Israel's campaigns in Gaza. And they were concerned about what they're going to find, that they would find evidence of Israel breaching the laws of war. But actually unanimously, their greatest concern at the end of that week we spent studying the IDF's operations was that their own armies would never be able to match the standards of the IDF, than the high bar that Israel had struck, and that they would therefore be greatly constrained themselves and held to a measure that they couldn't achieve. And I don't think it's just a question of anti-Israel stuff either. I think a lot of these people who try and smear the IDF are also trying to tie our hands behind our backs. They're trying to prevent Western armies from defending themselves and defending their people against the kind of insurgency and terrorism that we face.
So it's an interesting point, because I've heard a lot of colleagues of mine, because there are a lot of joint trainings or conferences with other leaders of Western armies around the world, and I hear these stories of people coming up to IDF commanders and saying, "What the hell are you guys doing? I mean, you're raising the bar so high. This would be impossible for anyone else to follow, and it's not really wise, when you're trying to win a war." So at the end of the day, why aren't those people? Why aren't there more people as vocal as you? Not from a pro-Israeli point of view, not from anything else, but the concern of their own of the future of their own country.
Well, I think it's become very clear to me, as I mentioned before, when you raise your head above the parapet, when you say anything about Israel that's not condemnatory, and particularly if you say something good about Israel or the IDF, then you attract a lot of flack. And I think a lot of people, obviously most serving officers can't really make public comment on political issues affecting other armies. And when they retire, they've spent their life fighting, or, you know, in one sort of conflict or another. The last thing they want to do is spend their retirement having another fight. Well, personally, I've always been a fighter. I joined the army to fight when I left school. And I enjoy a fight, but I also particularly enjoy a fight if I know that I'm on the side of right in fighting that fight. But that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. Everybody is not quite as crazy as I am, and they're perhaps more interested in a quieter life. And I can't say I blame them for that.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me ask you something before we kind of finish up. I'm curious to hear your opinion about, you know, the recently signed peace of Abraham's Accord, the peace accord between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. I mean, from your point of view and all the time that you've spent in the Middle East, what is your take on this?
I think it's an outstanding move. It could only have been done by the current US administration, which came at it from a very different angle to generations of peace processors who have been battering their heads against a problem, coming up with the same solution, expecting a different answer every time. We know that, I think it was Einstein that said that's the definition of insanity. But I spoke to some of the people, the senior people involved in this process in the US when they first started out down this path under the current administration. And I think they've achieved exactly what they had hoped to achieve. They have achieved a real step forward, I think, in terms of peace in the Middle East between Israel and the Arab countries. And they've shifted the paradigm, or are shifting the paradigm with which Israel is viewed. And I think people are now beginning to see, as probably most Arab countries see, that it's not Israel that's a problem. It's the Palestinian leadership that's a problem. It's the Palestinian leadership that's betrayed its own people repeatedly betrayed its own people, and cannot face the idea of any kind of rapprochement with Israel. The leadership of the Palestinians, whether it's in Gaza or in Judea and Samaria, what they want is one thing. They don't want peace with Israel. They want the annihilation of Israel. And this move, I think, will, if anything, could succeed in dragging them away from that and maybe convincing their people they're being betrayed by their own leaders. I think this move is likely to do that. But it had to be done from a completely new position where the Palestinian leadership was not given a veto over any progress. They had the option to take part, to join in, and they of course rejected it. But it was not going to end. There was not going to be no Abraham agreements if the Palestinians didn't agree. And as some people say, the path to peace was always seen to lead through Ramallah. Well, now everybody knows the path to peace doesn't lead through Ramallah, and I'm confidently expecting other Arab countries to join the Abraham Accords and to be a great success. And I believe that both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu and the leaders of the UAE and Bahrain deserve the next Nobel Peace Prize. They won't get it because the Nobel Peace Committee is intrinsically opposed to where they're coming from, but they certainly deserve it for what they've done so far.
Well, this is an interesting, you know, I've been following how the, you know, most media outlets in the Western world have covered this story or their lack of coverage of the story in most cases. And I find it to be just mind-boggling, really. It's peace. And, you know, how is this possible that, the liberals of the world are not celebrating, a situation that was, just a couple of years back seemed impossible. I mean, growing up in Israel, we're used to this reality where wherever we go in our own neighborhood, we're hated and we're not welcome. And there's always this dream of peace. And then, peace is signed, and this is how the world kind of treats it. It's for us, it's just, even though we kind of expected it, it was still shocking to see or not to see what was really how it was really covered, how it was really dealt with by most of the world. But I do want to get to one last thing, because I know that, you know, the issue of the International Criminal Court of the ICC is also something that has been troubling you in the context of the UK, in the context of a little bit of the US, and also in the Israeli context. And again, what kind of precedents, you know, this court will set, and how it will tie the hands of armies in the years to come. So can you tell us what you're doing about that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the International Criminal Court has a great reason to exist, and it was formed with the best possible motives. It was intended to be essentially the next generation Nuremberg tribunals, which was there to bring to justice those people who had committed war crimes but couldn't, or the countries they were in didn't have the ability or the will to bring them to justice. So that was the purpose of it. And it was a good purpose, but it's been distorted, it's been corrupted, it's been turned now into a political court. The three prime suspects of the International Criminal Court, so predictably, are the United States, Israel, and the United Kingdom, the great Satan and the two little Satans. And none of those three countries should be in the dock of the ICC, because they each of those three has very, very highly internationally regarded and historic legal institutions, and are more than capable, as they've proved time and time again, of dealing with their own problems without the ICC interference. But of course, it's low-hanging fruit for the ICC, because they attract support from media, they attract support from academics and from international organizations like the UN and the European Union, to have a dig at these three countries. And so they do their damnedest to do that. And yes, those three are in the dock. Israel for alleged war crimes in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria, and Britain for Iraq, and America for Afghanistan. And it beggars belief when you think also that neither Israel or the US signed up to the International Criminal Court, even though Britain was foolish enough to do so, despite people like me warning the government against it when we did. But it's hugely problematic, because it does, you know, whatever the outcome of these things, they end up damaging legitimate Western democracies' reputations in ways that could be unrepairable. So I think we have to fight against it in every way we can. I was very pleased to see that I think something like 13 member states of the ICC, including Germany, made a complaint to the International Criminal Court about bringing Israel before the court accused of the war crimes, because they recognized that it was just a pure political distortion of the ICC. But nevertheless, the ICC appears to be going to plow ahead with it. They're going to make a decision soon about the extent of their pre-prosecution investigations. And it has to be counted.
Yeah, it's not as optimistic as 13, and they have made statements about the legality of the issue at stake right now is the issue of jurisdiction, the ICC's jurisdiction, which brings in a whole fundamental questions like, is Palestine a state? Where is the territory of that state? Does the ICC have jurisdiction over non-state parties, et cetera, which is, as far as we're concerned, and my organization was a part, we submitted an amicus, and there were other groups as well, and from a just purely legal point, I think those questions are so easy. If it wasn't politically motivated, if they really could understand the gist of what the story really is about, it wouldn't have taken more than 5 minutes to decide that this is completely irrelevant to the court. But from your point of view, your expertise, so you're coming into this as a military expert. You plan on making submissions, articles. I mean, I know that you've been very, very active and very, very concerned about how the ICC is going to take these three cases forward.
I've certainly written a number of articles about these, both in relation to the UK and in relation to Israel and the US. And I intend to make whatever representations I'm able to. I have made representation to the ICC already, but I intend to do that in any way that I get the opportunity to do in the future, and also to influence decision makers in Western countries. And I think that's where organizations like yours, which I have to say does a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And I hope you continue to do it. It's where and not only your organization, but also anyone else who is interested in fighting this fight. I think that's really where the influence can be gained. Not necessarily so much in making direct representation to the ICC, although that should always be done if possible, but in influencing people through the media, in personal direct contact with decision makers, and I think critically with journalists as well, because many journalists today writing in the Western media have no understanding of this, and they do need to be educated. So I think anybody who is in a position to do so should take the opportunity of doing that. And incidentally, Britain, just for your viewers' interest, Britain has been hounding British soldiers for nearly 2 decades now over alleged war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've subjected many of our soldiers and retired soldiers to the fact that the British government has been afraid of the absolute horror of British soldiers being dragged into the dock in The Hague by the International Criminal Court. And that shows, I think, the effect that the ICC has. And by the way, all of the cases that have been concluded so far in these thousands have proved false.
So that actually is concerning to me, because what I see is an opportunity for the ICC to say, you know, they call it complementarity. So, you know, if the UK courts decided it to be false, maybe they need to have a look at it themselves. I think that's unfortunately how they view it, which if you read the mandate of the ICC, of the Rome Statute, and if you understand the background of the establishment of that court, that's not what the court was established. That wasn't what he was meant to be doing. It wasn't meant to be scrutinizing, you know, the judicial decisions of a democratic country with an open and transparent, fair hearings. That's not what this is about. And yet here we are, and these sad stories that you're telling us are just tragic. Richard, thank you so much for coming here and being with us. We're going to put a few of your articles here below the podcast so that people can read and people can access the information further. And let's keep up the good work. I mean, you do amazing work, and thank you so much for everything that you do and your cooperation. We are extremely grateful for it.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I would reciprocate that. I think, as I mentioned, your organization does really fantastic work. Thank you very much indeed for hosting me.
Thank you so much.